weeks ago, we had another celebration. Today is a 13-year anniversary, a 13-year birthday for Austin Baptist Church. But just a few weeks ago, we were celebrating the 244th birthday of our nation. And I don't know about you, but 4th of July felt different this year, did it not? It was an interesting time to be having that party, because normally that party's carried with a whole lot of pageantry and patriotism, and we have all these festivities to look forward to. And for most in this room, we celebrated our Declaration of Independence quietly in our homes. And it's an interesting season of life where we find ourselves, where all of the country, you could argue, has perhaps never been as polarized in American history, where you have civil unrest in the streets, you have a pandemic that has gone all over the world, but nonetheless, we celebrated, I hope we did, I know I did, I celebrated the freedom that we have here in this country, and I still do believe that we are lucky and fortunate, and I'll use the word blessed, to be in the greatest nation on this entire planet. But on that day, on July 4th, what we celebrated was the Declaration of Independence. And even if you're not a history buff, most likely you're familiar with the second sentence. And in the second sentence, Thomas Jefferson wrote this. He said that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So Jefferson, he writes down what he says all of us are supposed to have in this country. And it's not because of legislation, it's because we all carry the image of God. And as his creation, that we all are given these unalienable rights. And he says, life, that all of us are entitled to breathe the air we are breathing right now. He says all of us are entitled to liberty, that all of us should make the decisions of what we want to do with our lives and then be held accountable by God for those decisions. But then he brings up this topic of happiness. And isn't it interesting that he doesn't guarantee happiness? He says, life, you can count on it. Liberty, yep. But then when it came to happiness, if you caught the language, he said, good luck. Best luck, Godspeed. Because what he said was, I'm not guaranteeing you happiness, but I'm guaranteeing you the ability to pursue it. Now, why would Jefferson word it that way? Why would our founding fathers not just go on a roll and guarantee all three? I think it's because in their wisdom, they understood happiness is a very fickle thing. If you don't believe that, just watch me. If by God's providence we actually have Aggie football here in a few weeks, you're going to notice I'm going to be a very happy person for probably the first half of the season. Because if you know Aggie football, we always win the first half of our games. That we always win them and we get ranked and we get our hopes up and we think this is the year, and then you know what's going to happen. The SEC games are going to come on the schedule. And then we'll get kicked around and knocked around by the SEC West, and you'll notice, wow, Jonathan was really happy, but now he's really sad. And why? It's because happiness is fleeting. If you don't believe that, I would dare you, look at your own life today. I would contend you are probably less happy than you were in January or February. And you might say, why is that? It's because March changed everything. March changed everything in this nation. Where if you looked back then, you had no idea, none of us did, where we'd be here in July today. But in February, you could look at your life, and for many of us, we were thinking economy's booming, unemployment's low, my investments are doing great, summer's on the horizon, I've got a vacation planned, my children are in school, we had a great Super Bowl, March Madness is coming, church is going great, we've got all these programs, all these buildings, all these wonderful things. And then, of course, what happened? March came. And over 140,000 Americans have died due to complications of the coronavirus. But I can tell you that that's not the only loss that's been had. That while not all of us, and most of us in this country, have not lost our lives, many of us have lost our happiness. That virtually everyone in this country looks back and they grieve the loss in their life. Some are grieving the loss of their finances, where literally 20 million people lost their jobs and they don't know how to make ends meet. Some are grieving the loss of their portfolio, where they thought they were going to retire and now they're struggling. I don't know if that's going to happen. Students are grieving the loss of their schools, that they miss their friends, they miss the structure. Parents are missing that as well. They're grieving that they can't drop them off, that they're having to deal with it at home and figure all this out, even though they didn't sign up to be homeschool parents. That's where we are. that churches we grieved, that we couldn't come together for Easter, that we struggled to keep these doors open, that we've all experienced loss, and everyone today in this room and those that are online, we'd all agree, I'm less happy today than I was in January. But the reality is, and the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ is, if you have Christ in you, you don't have to jump on that roller coaster ride. That actually Jesus Christ's desire for my life and your life is that we have this lasting happiness. And what we're going to discover through studying the Sermon on the Mount, and specifically the first 12 verses known as the Beatitudes, in the coming weeks, we're going to see that our own Savior, the greatest teacher of all time, will preach the greatest sermon ever preached to all of us here in this room. And what he's going to do is he's going to unlock the secret to how to pursue happiness in very complicated times. So if you have your Bible, open up with me. Matthew chapter 5 is where we are. If you have a bookmark, you can bookmark it because we will not be leaving this passage for about 8 weeks. We're going to be camped out on these 12 verses. And today we're going to start from the beginning in verse 1. We're told, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. Now who's the he? Jesus. It says, and when Jesus sat down, his disciples came to him. Now, before we go any further, we need to set the scene so you know really what's happening here. It says that Jesus sees a bunch of crowds. Now, Matthew chapter 5 is at the beginning phase of Jesus' earthly ministry. If you know the chapters that come previous, in chapter 3, there's a monumental moment where Jesus' ministry is inaugurated, where Jesus, for the first 30 years of his life on this earth, he really lived in obscurity. He was a small-town carpenter no one really knew a whole lot about. His siblings, we're told in the scriptures, didn't really believe that he was the Son of God. And then out of nowhere, in Matthew chapter 3, God had plans to show everybody who his Son is. And in Matthew chapter 3, John the Baptist, you remember, he's baptizing. And Jesus comes in onto the scene and he tells John, I want you to dunk me too, buddy. And John looks at him and he says, I'm not worthy to touch your sandals. I don't deserve any of it. And Jesus says, you're going to baptize me. And why? It wasn't because Jesus needed to be cleansed. It was because he wanted to show you and I that we needed to. He set the example for us stepping into those waters. But Jesus goes into the waters, and if you've read that story, it's an amazing moment where sometimes we say the Trinity, our triune God's very complicated. This is one of the rare moments in Scripture where you see our triune God come together, working in unison for the glory of God, where you see God the Son step into the waters. You see God the Holy Spirit descend upon him like a dove to empower and enable Jesus to begin his earthly ministry. And then you hear God the Father speak, this is my Son in whom I am well pleased. And in that moment, instantly, everyone knew this guy's not a carpenter, that this guy's different, that this is the Son of God. And in chapter 4, Jesus begins his earthly ministry. And how does he begin it? In the wilderness. That Jesus goes out and he's tested and tried for 40 days and 40 nights. He's stuck with Satan, and Satan tries to make him stumble, but of course Jesus is the only one to endure all temptation but never fail. He overcomes all of it. He perseveres, makes it through, and then he begins his ministry. And in verse 17 of chapter 4, what we're told is Jesus begins a preaching ministry. And he preaches saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is here. And people come to listen. It's amazing when Jesus speaks, people want to hear, which is why I think this is going to be filled up, is that I'm not Jesus, but I'm going to speak Jesus' words for you to listen to. And when Jesus speaks, the word of God does not return void, and people are starting to come. And they're all flooding to Jesus, wanting to know, who is this guy and what's he doing? And he starts healing. And in chapter 5, he finds himself on this mountain, we're told, and there's massive crowds. That suddenly there's all these people saying, we want to be around him. Who is he? What's he have to say? It's so different. And it says that he went up on this mountain. Now, the mountain that they're on is really not a mountain. It's really hills. And previously, there was nothing sacred about this territory. It was on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. There's some hills that slope there into the terrain. And Jesus goes up that mountain to speak. And when he speaks, it says that he sat down. Why would Jesus sit down? It's because it was the traditional posture for any rabbi. That if you wanted to have authority and actually speak something that mattered to your disciples, you sat down and you started to tell them how it is. And Jesus does this. He goes up this mountain, sits down, and what he does is he starts to tell everyone through chapters 5 to 7 of what God really wants from us in our lives. And it's amazing the parallel from the Old Testament to the New. If you know your Old Testament, Moses in Exodus, what does he do? Goes up a mountain. And he goes up a mountain to do what? To hear from the Lord and establish the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant, that he goes up there to receive the law. Jesus Christ, who's the leader of the new covenant, what does he do? He goes up a different mountain, not to receive the law, but to reconstruct it. Because at that point, everybody knew the rules. All the Jews knew these are the things I'm supposed to do and not do. The problem was they weren't very good at following them. Doesn't that sound familiar? And what Jesus is going to tell them is, hey, even if you do good and you check all these religious boxes and you're doing a great job, I can see that your hearts are still a mess and you're not really free. And so many people in modern evangelicalism are the same. They can check a box with a lot of religious things and get it done, but God looks at your heart and says, but it's still filled with rage, that you still have anxiety, that you're still greedy, you're still envious, you're still lustful. And Jesus, through this sermon, is going to say, God doesn't just want your actions, he wants your heart. He's not looking for you to give him things. He's looking for you to give yourself to him because he wants to change you. And it all begins here with what's known as the Beatitudes. And Jesus opens up his mouth, going to verse 2. He opened up his mouth and he taught them, saying, blessed. And let's just pause there on the blessed. It's a word that we all have to come and know because it's a word we're going to hear every week for 8 weeks, so we need to do some due diligence on this. That word blessed, you might say, why do we call it the Beatitudes? In Latin, the word is beatus, where the word beatus is where we get that word beatitude. And so he says this word blessed, but in the Greek, it's makarios. And makarios is a word that they would not have heard very often from a Jewish rabbi in the context of human involvement. Because the Greek word makarios really pointed towards a lasting happiness. It could even be defined as being fortunate, blissful, or even happy. And the ancient Greeks would use this word. Homer would use this to describe the Greek gods, that they had makarios. And makarios was this happiness that was unwavering, that it didn't matter what happened in the world. They didn't experience human weakness, human disease, human pain, human suffering. So the gods, they would argue, had this makarios, this lasting happiness that was unwavering. Didn't matter what happened in the world, they always would press forward. So Jesus uses this word, and it's a very interesting word because what he's trying to say is this definition that we're going to work with for the sake of this series. To be blessed means to possess an inner satisfaction and sufficiency that does not depend on outward circumstances. When he uses this word, he's going to tell us there is a form of happiness that does exist. And he says it's an inner satisfaction. It has nothing to do with what's going on around you. And there's a sufficiency, meaning this blessedness, this happiness can last and it's good enough and it will give you all that you need and it doesn't depend on anything that's happening around you. And Jesus says that blessedness, that makarios, that happiness, it exists and it's available. So the question would then be, how do I get it? How do I experience that makarios in my own life? And Jesus each week is going to give us 8 simple reminders to tell us if we pursue these things, what we're actually doing is we're pursuing makarios. We're pursuing happiness in our own lives. So see what he has to say. Go back to verse 3. For our first one this week, he says, blessed are who? The poor. Blessed are the poor. It's a pretty big letdown if you were hoping for something better than that. Because normally when we think poor, we don't think very blessed. It's the opposite of blessed. Poor is struggle, strife, difficulty, but Jesus says, blessed are the poor. And in the Greek, he's not just saying poor, because normally in our terms in the 21st century here in metropolitan Austin, you say, hey, I'm poor, Jonathan. Probably what that means is you're on a budget. Like it means you can't probably go eat out all the time and do these things, but you're probably not the kind of poor Jesus is talking about. Because in the Greek, once again, what he's talking about is beggars, begging poor. He says the worst kind of poor actually means to shrink or cower. He's saying the people on the streets that have absolutely nothing, that kind of dirt poor, don't have a nickel to their name, that they're totally dependent on the generosity of others to live. He says, blessed are those guys. Blessed are those who are begging poor, which you might say, still that makes no sense. And the reason why is because he's not talking about money. He's not talking about money. I can tell you, I've known people with a lot of money that are really happy, and I've known a lot of people with a lot of money that are miserable. And I've known poor people that are the kindest, most gracious, joyful people I've ever seen, but likewise, I've known poor people that are suffering. You see, money doesn't matter. Money doesn't buy happiness, even though the devil will try to tell you it does. It doesn't do any of it. So Jesus is not talking about anything monetary here. Instead, what does he say? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit. He's speaking of spiritual poverty. He says those that have nothing spiritually in them, man, they're in a great spot. He says those that are spiritually bankrupt, which what does that mean? It means you come to the humble realization in your life that there is a God and you're not it. That there's a God that reigns and rules and he's on a throne, and you might think you have a throne, but finally the lights open up that, man, I'm seated on nothing. And what I'm seated on, actually God provided for me, and I'm not in charge of anything. That I might have thought I had a kingdom, but really I have no kingdom. He has the entire thing. That the very breath I have is a gift from God, not from myself or anyone else. That it's coming to the realization that there's a God that's good and holy and you're not him. And it's coming to the realization that, man, my life is broken, that even though I might have the external part done, the internal part's a wreck, and I can't fix myself. And God knows it, and he says, when you know it, you're blessed. He says there's no greater place to be than in that humble realization. John Stott puts it this way. I enjoyed his definition. He said, to be poor in spirit is to acknowledge our spiritual poverty. Indeed, our spiritual bankruptcy before God. For we are sinners under the wrath of God and deserving nothing but the judgment of God. And we have nothing to offer, nothing to plead, nothing with which we can buy the favor of heaven. Jesus is saying people are blessed when they understand those words. When they understand I have no bargaining chips with my Maker, that I am totally dependent on his grace in my life, that I need him to change me, I can't change myself. And Jesus says when your eyes are open to that, you become happy. And why? It's our first point today. Why are the humble happy? It's because humility is the pathway to the kingdom. Humility is the pathway to the kingdom. Going back to that verse, he says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Why? For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says there's only one prerequisite to getting into heaven, and it's not what you can provide, it's what you can surrender. He says it's you acknowledging, I've got nothing, God, I can't do it myself, but thank you that you bought my ticket for me because I never could cover that bill. Years ago, when Bethany and I were engaged, we've been married now for 10 years, but about 11 years ago, when we were engaged, we were preparing for the bachelor party, not her, but me, and we were looking towards that of obviously there's that final moment, the hurrah, that the guys come together and do something fun, and at that age and stage in our life, I was an intern over at Second Baptist Church making hardly anything. My friends were making hardly anything. We didn't really have any connections, and it was going to be the lamest bachelor party we ever could have imagined until a guy that was one of my youth workers. I was a youth minister back then. He was pretty accomplished, had done quite a few things in business in Houston with a big corporation. And he came up to me, he said, Jonathan, you got a party coming up, right? And I said, yeah, we're kind of figuring out what to do. He said, well, I would like to give you some tickets to the Astros if y'all'd like them. And I said, well, that's great. You know, free tickets are great. He said, they're my business's tickets. They're corporate seats, and you can enjoy them. I want you to enjoy these tickets. I said, well, thank you, because any free ticket's a wonderful ticket. But at the same time, I didn't realize those free tickets were what's known as Diamond Club tickets. If you don't know what Diamond Club is, that's okay. You actually do know what it is if you've ever watched the Houston Astros, because when you watch the Houston Astros, you always see those few rows of seats right behind home plate. Normally you see like George Bush and Nolan Ryan and all these heavy hitters. Well, on one fateful day, you would have seen an intern named Jonathan Spencer and all of his Goonie friends. It was a bunch of idiots that didn't belong in there, but the reason we were there is because my buddy gave me this ticket. And when I got this ticket to the Diamond Club, I didn't realize that the Diamond Club's more than a seat, it's an experience. Because what we did was we pulled up to Minute Maid Ballpark and we parked literally 10 yards from the front door. It was as if we were on the roster. We walked up to the door to a private entrance. We go in, then we went down a private escalator underneath the ballpark, which I didn't even know there was such a thing, but we went under this building. And when we came off the escalator, we went to a private dining hall, which they had this all-you-can-eat buffet, of course, comp to everybody, and they had everything from prime rib to hot dogs if you're a traditionalist. And we went in there and gorged ourselves. I mean, we ate an ungodly amount of food, and we do all these things. Then we get up, and we head to our seats, which once again was awesome because you're going down a private tunnel as if you're on the team, heading up to those key seats right behind home plate. And as I'm going down the tunnel, I see there's these concession stands with no workers, which was really weird to me that there's a bunch of stuff there, but nobody behind it. And I was like, what is that? They go, oh, just help yourself. Get whatever you want. So I was like, all right. I just start stuffing things in my jacket, taking it all with me, and I walk out and I get to my seat. And as I came out of that tunnel, I looked at the view and the beauty of that ballpark from the bottom level. And I can tell you in my heart, this truth came to mind. I couldn't have purchased that ticket, that I don't belong here, that there's no reason that I should be in these seats. There's no reason for me to have all of this given to me, that ticket had to be purchased by somebody else. And such is the kingdom of heaven, that if you think you deserve to be there, I hate to say it, you're probably not going there. That's a tough word, but it's true. That who inherits the kingdom of heaven? The poor in spirit. Those saying, I don't deserve it. That God, I've done nothing. In fact, Isaiah says, your greatest day is filthy rags. He says, I've done nothing. But one day we're going to walk up there to heaven and we'll be there and we'll look around and we're going to see what Paul says when he says, no eye has seen nor ear has heard what God has planned for those who love him. We'll see it and all we'll humbly say is, thank you. Thank you that your son purchased that ticket for me. I don't deserve any of it. So Jesus is saying, blessed are those that come to that realization, and humility will lead you there to understand that we're not the rulers of this universe, and what's been given to you is strictly an act of grace from our God. So he says the humble are happy because they do understand that. They understand that humility is the pathway to the kingdom. But our second point I want us to drive home today is also this: humility gives us a proper perspective. So not only does humility ultimately lead us down the pathway to heaven, it gives us a proper perspective, that those that are poor in spirit understand that all this other stuff that's happening around us, it's secondary. It's not primary. That all this other stuff, it too shall pass, and that one day we're going to be where we belong. Years ago, I've been doing this now for many years in Houston. As you all know, we're coming from Houston to Austin, and I am thrilled to be coming to Austin, Texas for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that it doesn't rain here like it does in Houston. And when I say it rains in Houston, some of y'all understand this, some of you do not. It floods so much there, so much. I mean, it's honestly very sad. I've been there for 12 years, and in the last 5 years, I know families that have had their homes flooded 3 times, where they've had to completely gut their houses. And through the course of ministry at Second, we would obviously come alongside, as the church should in a moment of crisis, that is an opportunity for us to shine brightly for him. So we would enable and deploy volunteers and staff to go muck houses. And I can't tell you how many houses I've had to muck in the last many years, but there was one home in particular I came to, and that house stood out to me because it was somebody I knew. Sometimes you go to houses, you have no idea who they are, but I knew whose house it was that I was going to. He too was a young man with 3 young children. There were a lot of parallels to him and me in our lives and where we were at. And I show up at his house, and I'm prepared to put on the pastor hat. I'm prepared to have to give him the encouragement speech, to hug him, to love him, to have him cry on a shoulder, him and his wife. And as we pulled up to that house, and they had just literally lost everything, I was shocked as he came out and greeted us, and he had the biggest smile on his face that I've ever seen, and hope filled in his eyes, and I'm the one who was ministered to. And why? It's because he was poor in spirit. That he understood he had nothing here, but he also understood he still had that which mattered most. You see, when you come to a relationship with Jesus Christ and you give your life to him, you can come to this understanding that you can have nothing in this world, but if you have Jesus Christ, you have everything. And all this other stuff, it's just white noise, that it doesn't matter. That I've buried quite a few people, I've seen many others in their cemeteries. I hate to break it to you, you take nothing with you, nothing. You could put it in the casket, it's not going home with you, that it's there. That when we come to this realization that all the stuff's just white noise, that my purpose isn't to fill it up, it's to be filled up by him and be used by him in this world, then all of a sudden you're blessed. You have a sustaining happiness that weathers every single storm. And for him, my friend, he had that moment, and you look at him and you would have never known that literally he just lost everything. And many in this room, you feel like you've lost everything. For some of you, it's because you have to literally put on a mask. For others in this room, perhaps it's because you've had to cancel vacations. Maybe you had a wedding that had to get postponed. Maybe it's because you lost a job. Maybe your portfolio's gone down. Maybe it's because you have kids running crazy in your house and you're ready to get rid of them. That we've all lost things in the last few months. But I can tell you, those that are poor in spirit, those that walk on their knees, they still have everything. That you can lose everything, but if you still have the rock, if you remember what I talked about 2 weeks ago, the foundation of Jesus Christ under you, you've got sure footing. The Apostle Paul understood this best. Philippians chapter 4, I want to cross-reference with one passage before we wrap up. The apostle explains that this is a man that's lost everything, he's had everything and had nothing all at the same time. Verse 11, he says, "Not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I've learned in whatever situation I'm in, to be content." He says, "I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound, and in every circumstance I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need." And what is the secret? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Paul understood that sometimes we've got nothing to be happy about in this world, but we can be blessed and have a lasting happiness because, once again, if you've got Christ with you and he's riding the storm alongside you, then you've got all you need. Which our third point today, and we'll wrap up with this thought, is why are the humble happy? It's because humility keeps us close to Christ. Paul was smart enough to know I can't do this on my own, that really the world is too much for me. But he says, I can do all things through Jesus Christ who gives me strength. That if I have Christ with me, then I can take on anything in this world. And Jesus is saying the same truth to you and I, that the weight of this world is too heavy for you to carry. But he's saying, if you let me just come alongside you, if you admit that you need me, if you confess in humility, he says, and you draw near to me, I'll draw near to you, and I will help you carry that burden. My children are all young, as many of y'all know, and my oldest is 8 years old now, but when she was younger, it's interesting to watch your children obviously grow up and start to mature and do things that they otherwise could not do in previous years. And I remember Emma, when she was about 3 years old, she thought she had grown up a little quicker than she had. And we still to this day, we make breakfast and do everything for our kids, and we completely take care of all the little ones around the house because they need us. We have to do that. But Emma, at about age 3 or 4, thought, well, you know what? I've been watching my dad do it long enough. I know how to do this on my own. So you can imagine the scene. I walked into the kitchen. She's got her bowl of cereal, and there's just Cheerios everywhere. It's all over the place. She tried to pour it all in there. And as I walk in there, she's struggling to carry this big gallon of milk. And I watch her mid-pour, and as you can imagine, it's just going everywhere and making this big mess. And why did she do it? It was because she'd watched me do it before and thought she'd learned. She thought she had the power to do it herself. But the sad part is, I was right next door, that I would have been happy to help her carry that weight that she was not ready for, but she thought she could do it on her own. And because of that, what happens? There's a big old mess to clean up. Many Christians carry the weight of their lives on their own. The most confusing part of Christianity to me is Christless Christianity. Where people think, yep, I get it. God, I need you to save me from hell, but I don't need you to save me from anything today. I've got it. I'll take care of it. I've watched you do it enough in the Bible. I've seen the preacher. I've got all my troubles. I'll get it done. And what we find out when we walk like that, there's a lot of messes around us. A lot of messes that have to get cleaned up. And that's why blessed are the poor in spirit, because they understand that I need to be close to Jesus Christ. I'm not strong enough to carry the weight of this world. And Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary, all who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Jesus Christ wants to help you carry that load. And if you're in a season of unhappiness, my question to you is, how are you pursuing it? Are you pursuing it in your own flesh? For some in this room and some online, you may be rich in flesh, but are you poor in spirit? Have you actually surrendered those things to Jesus Christ? Because I can tell you, Jesus Christ has a makarios, a happiness available to you and I that can only come from him. But the only way you can obtain it is if you humbly say, Lord, I need you. That, Lord,